Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess, publisher of Lawfare. This week, researcher and author Denis Newiak on blackouts in film and TV.
A blackout is not only darkness, it's not just about the lights are going off, but the total end of communication, of responding society. You cannot call anybody to help you. Of course, it's not comfortable to talk about these things, It's not about preparing for the end of the world. It's about preparing to be on yourself, maybe for 7 days, for 10 days. And this is maybe one thing that we can all learn from the motion pictures and from the TV shows. I would say it would be the task also of governments to educate people who are not talking about this topic as we are doing. State can do a lot to help those who cannot help themselves, but it could be everybody who needs help in such a situation. So everybody is asked to do their best.
Denis, thank you for joining us on Chatter.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Tell us about how someone gets into media cultural history and manages to make a career out of watching disaster movies. How does this happen?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, I was always fascinated by films, television. I watched a lot of stuff in my youth, and someday I thought it should be my profession. And one of my favorite genres was always disaster movies. I don't know why. I just thought it's fascinating to see what happens if society somehow gets disrupted or gets confronted with a problem which they have to deal with it, because it says a lot about how our society works. And then, it was like a main topic of my research now. I actually finished my PhD in a completely different topic. No, maybe not completely different topic. It's about loneliness research and representations of loneliness, or you could say social isolation in modern society in TV and cinema. And where the pandemic, I thought it should be interesting also to look into the real catastrophes, the real disasters, and how they are represented in film and television.
There's a lot to dig into there. So going back to, and I'm the same way, as far back as I can remember as a kid, I liked watching the movies where big things happen, not the character study of this couple and what they go through in normal life. Although I respect the work and the people who appreciate it, for me, I wanted the big epic disasters happening. For you, what was the draw? Was it more the disaster, for you, the attraction being the actual catastrophe? Or was it more about how people deal with it and what it says about us?
I think it's more the second part. Of course, it's always fun to watch spectacular movies, to see all the action, and but I think the second question is more interesting because I'm also very interested in politics, and I'm very curious about how people are managing future questions. For example, just think about climate change. Now we have the situation with the energy crisis, and I think film and television can talk a lot about how we can deal with those problems, and that's what I'm most curious about. And that's also may be the main topic of my books at the moment. As I feel in the moment that we have big issues to find answers for the big questions of our time. And sometimes you need big pictures for those questions in TV and film. And at the moment, I think we can learn a lot from the media.
What do you think is the main, we say gateway drug, what is the main way that people get into this field from others that you've worked with? Is it from that fascination with the film and TV growing up? Or do you think it is from that sociology side and they apply it to film and TV? So your colleagues, are they similarly wired to you, or did they come to this from a different place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this topic of science fiction movies in general is not so popular in film and TV research at the moment. It's coming somehow now because somehow science fiction became reality in the last years, so you have to deal with that. But it's still not a big problem for researchers in this field. But if I talk to colleagues about my research, actually, I hear that they are curious about what I'm doing, and they think it's a nice idea. But there are so many interesting questions, in each academic discourse. So this is only one problem, and I love also to watch movies for completely different reasons. For example, for a nice film music, I'm very interested in, or for my loneliest topic. So, but I think they fit together. They work together.
Talk a little bit more about your research that led to your dissertation. You said it was about the issue of loneliness and loneliness as it's expressed in media. What were your key takeaways from doing all of that work?
Yeah. Actually, it was just that when I was watching movies and television series, I had the feeling that this is somehow a main topic in the moment, and that it is increasing as it is a discourse in a fictional context and fictional filmic works. And I did a lot of research looking into sociological work, philosophical work, and I found that many of these very complex thoughts which are developed in academic discourses are somehow in a way that you can feel these very abstract problems in the TV and in the cinema, because, loneliness, it does not just mean to me that people feels a romantic loneliness. For example, nobody loves me and everybody hates me. That's just maybe one dimension of the whole problem. But that would be my my hypothesis, that modernity somehow tends to you could say grow social isolation as a problem in modern society. And you can see this, for example, with digitalization, with social media. Everybody now somehow knows that it does not does good to us, because it sometimes we feel just lost in front of the screens, scrolling down of these images. And of course, we see the other people, but we cannot connect to them. And that's, of course, only one dimension. So, long answer to a short question. The key takeaway would be that it makes us feel more comfortable talking about this taboo topic of loneliness when we have the opportunity to watch it and to talk about what we see, because it's always easier to talk about a film or a TV series than about, big philosophical issues.
Now, some films make that obvious, that is the point of the narrative. I'm thinking here of something like WALL-E, where loneliness and separation is part of the story. Others, it's at best subtext, or maybe the filmmaker doesn't realize it at all. But something about creating the fact that viewers are watching this happen, it's almost like a hidden theme, which is one of the things you explored.
That's right. Sometimes it's hidden, or you could say it's hidden between the different aesthetic levels, as I call them in my dissertation, of films and TV series, because it's not only about talking about loneliness. I know you have not very often a situation that the characters are really phrasing it as a word, or that they are talking about it very directly. Actually, you have those situations as well in some series. It's exhausting sometimes. But what I'm more curious about, what pictures do they find for the problem of loneliness, or how does loneliness sound? Which soundtrack, for example, do they find? What is the score of being lonely? And actually, I would say, of course, they are sometimes more concrete, sometimes not so obvious. But one thing I found out is that loneliness has sometimes an interconnecting function, you could say, with communities as they are working together as a dramatization strategy. For example, think about The Big Bang Theory. They are very lonely characters. I think we can say that in the beginning. But they need these lonelinesses to show them how they build a functional community, not only with their partners at the end of the show, but also as a working community together. So the series needs this initial loneliness to explain them how they are dealing with this problem. And of course, it's funny to watch them, how they try to do their best to come together. And sometimes it's the other way around, that we have tragic, or you could say drama series, where we have functional communities at the beginning,
break apart,
and then they're falling apart. So it's somehow, interchanging between these two poles, community and loneliness, what I'm curious about.
It seems to me, just anecdotally, that the former is more common than the latter. That is, like, I can think of more examples of, these people who are perhaps lost, or perhaps just more independent, who in the course of a narrative find each other and everyone's better off and we all leave happy. I can think of more of those than I can think of the latter, where you have a well-functioning social unit and we just watch it fragment, but they're out there.
They are, I think, at the moment, even more those drama, tragic narratives. In my dissertation work, for example, I'm looking into 13 Reasons Why. I think it was a very popular series also in the United States with this girl who is killing herself because she is bullied at high school. It's more a youth series, and I think it's
what is the show?
13 Reasons Why.
Oh, okay.
It's a Netflix series, and you have, this very lovely, happy girl, and she is somehow trying to find her way in this new town. And actually, she finds some friends, and she has parents who love her, but all these small communities are falling apart step by step. Or second series I'm looking into it is Bates Motel.
Oh, yes.
Norman Bates as a. Yeah, we know what happens to him and what happens to the women who are visiting him. But in this series, they show that, and it's funny somehow to see it, that Norman, at the beginning, he's just a boy, and everybody is who becomes a murderer is just a boy at the beginning, unfortunately. And then they show what happened to him that he becomes what he became, what we know from the Hitchcock movie. And at the beginning, he also has his friends, and mother is not the beast as it is as it's shown in the movie. And the same thing happens. You could say that modernity somehow tries to that modern phenomena, like not only digitalization but also, you could say, acceleration, that he has to find his part in modern society. What is his part he could fulfill in this society? There's so many factors who are, you could say, destroying his connection to the others. And I think that's fascinating to watch, because it talks about a lot how our society works at the moment.
And it is increasingly common, it seems, for writers and filmmakers to get into that area. For example, you name one, I immediately think of something like Wicked, which is exploring the backstory of a character that people are fascinated by, or the Star Wars series going back to Solo to explore the origin story. But in telling the origin story, there's a different emotional narrative often than was in the original, because you're seeing how they got to the person they were. Yeah,
I think that's a trend in television at the moment. We are talking a lot about quality TV, and sometimes it's not easy to say what's so qualitative about quality TV. And I think one thing is that they try to get to the more complex questions than the movies, for example, in the 70s and 80s did. The movies and television, of course, are completely different. You have 90 minutes to talk about something, and then you have maybe 5 seasons with 20 episodes to talk through a complicated problem. But as we are watching a lot of TV shows now, I think this is also a sign for that we try to understand how things are working, how things are connected to each other, and why the characters are dealing with problems as they do, and why do they not do anything else than they are doing in the TV show. So I think it's just fascinating to see, to understand, you could say, the psychology or the character of a character in the motion pictures through a TV show who explains us, you could say, their feelings and their emotions in 5 seasons with 10 episodes, like in the Bates Motel, for example.
Right. Well, I was drawn to your work because I saw some of the things you'd done that related to what I would call national security related topics. Things like dealing with global pandemic, things like dealing with global blackouts and either the causes or the effects. And you have a great quote that I think captures why this matters to our audience. You wrote, "It is my hope that by making explicit the creative, behavioral, and problem-solving knowledge hidden in film and television, it will enable those who otherwise do not have or find access to film and television, or who have special responsibilities in crisis preparedness and management, to behave appropriately in a crisis." I mean, you're really thinking about those in positions of responsibility in politics, in administration, in business, and in a sense, how we can help them by understanding what has come out in this cultural history.
Yeah, actually, when I wrote those 2 books about the pandemics and about the blackouts, I always somehow hoped that maybe somebody would read those books who could somehow also deal with it in the nature that they really are reacting to those situations more, you could say, more reasonable, and that they are somehow prepared for disasters which are still coming in the future. Of course, with the pandemic, it was more or less a situation that I saw what is happening around us. And I had, after all the pandemic movie watching, the feeling that I have to write something about that. So it was more coming after the catastrophe with good tips and tricks. But now with the blackout issue, I think if we see in society that almost nobody's prepared for this problem, I really hope that the audience will somehow try to do the best if the situation sometimes maybe come up.
Well, we know we have listeners in the United States policymaking community and emergency management that hopefully will be exactly the audience you were trying to reach. So we've done that part. I do want to talk just briefly about the pandemic side before I turn to the topic that fascinated me, which is the global catastrophes or local catastrophes, but often global in film and TV that knock out electricity and take us back to a more primal place in many cases. But on the pandemic side, what did you find that film and television writ large, or in specific cases, got right and wrong once we saw how the COVID pandemic played out?
Yeah, that's it was just fascinating to see that, of course, all those narratives are always very dramatized. Of course, you have these pandemic narratives like zombie viruses killing almost everybody, and people have also to deal with this problem. COVID was something different, of course, but you also have those very nuanced films like, what's it called? Contagion. Of course, it's also still more dramatized than the COVID pandemic, and more people affected. But if you are watching this movie now, and I think many people have watched this movie in 2020 because it was just very popular again, after it was not that popular when it was released. And yeah, you're seeing these pictures, and this could also be news what you're watching when, for example, they have those hospitals in gyms, or if they have to bury all these dead bodies in the Central Park. So that was just somehow obvious to me that there are parallels and you have to deal with that. And then I was curious about what could happen still in the pandemic. It was 2020, so maybe April, May when the book arrived. And there was still some years to go with COVID.
Absolutely. And
there was, for example, one problem also in the Contagion movie with the conspiracy theories, which arrived then, especially in industrialized societies, not only, but it was just, I thought, why is this film thinking about this problem before we are dealing with that in reality? And it's the same thing is with the mask wearing, people are just wear the noses. Always not hidden, and they do not think about it. It's you have to learn to use these masks, which are for professional use in the first point. But those pictures were somehow, you could say, prophetic, and I just wanted to look deeper into it to see what is talked about in these pictures, which we will maybe dealing in the future, maybe not.
I find it interesting that in the what I will call the pandemic-related or pandemic-adjacent movies that I've seen, there is almost always either a major plot point or a supporting point of distrust of government. That the very people who have decided to serve in the public sector in order to protect people in many of the areas explored are the very ones that people don't trust. What does that say about our pandemic response? Because we've seen a lot of that in different countries around the world, that it becomes an anti-government thing, which is not in one's self-interest. You're actually harming yourself and your family by not taking protective measures. But because it's the government telling you to take those measures, you feel like you are being oppressed.
Yeah, of course, I thought a lot about that question. And sorry, I cannot talk about, of course, governments, because my main issue of topic of research is television and cinema. But what I can say from the material, what I got through is maybe two main points there. So, of course, always a lot more to say. But there are two things which are always coming up again. The first thing is, again, I think transparency, that the people in these movies sometimes feel that not everything is told them, to put it very easily. But that I would not say that this was a problem in the pandemic, but only the feeling that this could be the problem can be a problem to the people, to the characters in these series and in these movies. And the second thing is, and I can understand the characters in this situation. Sometimes they have the feeling they did not enough to prepare us for that situation. They have the power, they have the money to buy masks in advance. They have the money, the power, if we are thinking about the blackout topic, for example, to push their emergency responses before something happens. And everybody knows that these disasters will eventually happen in the future, and not every single individual is able to prepare for those problems by themselves, because it's just expensive and not everybody has the knowledge about that. So in short, I think the most worrying issue is that if the public in those pictures has the feeling that governments did not their job, you could say, right, then it's not easy to deal with that, because they think we're doing our job every day. Do your job.
Right. Well, to the topic of the global blackout, the subject of your book, Preparing for the Global Blackout, a disaster guide from TV and cinema, there's hardly anything more taken for granted in modern society than electricity. And at an individual level, you don't notice this until you walk into a room, and if it still has a switch in it, you flip the switch to turn the lights on, and the lights don't come on. Because it's such an automated thing that, at least in my experience, I've seen myself do it, I've seen others do it, is you look at the switch as if you've never seen it before, and suddenly you flip it off and on again as if that's going to change it. And sometimes you'll do that over and over again. And it's got to be fun to watch that as a psychologist or sociologist, to see the human reaction to something that is so taken for granted. You've explored how electricity, which has made life safer in myriad ways, has also made it more dangerous than ever because of this vulnerability. Talk about blackout as a real thing and how it does affect people.
You cannot imagine how many areas of society would be affected by such a situation. We had, of course, already blackouts in the past. I just have to write down when was the last big blackout in the United States. Was 2013, something like that?
It's been a little while, but I remember that big East Coast blackout in Canada. There was a big one.
So you have some experience with these problems, but the thing is that these blackouts mostly are over after several hours, or maybe after a day, 2 days. And of course, it's not comfortable to the most people. For some people, it's a big problem in hospitals, for example, or in critical infrastructure. So you have to prepare also for those situations. But the worrying thing is, you could say, the most problematic thing about blackouts is if they do not stop after 1 or 2 days. And then you see, okay, what do I do if my cell phones are not working anymore? Because all the mobile communication is, you could say, prepared for blackouts of 30 minutes or 60 minutes, and then it's just gone. And just think about, especially young people, who they are completely dependent on working smartphones, and what's happening to them when the battery is low. Right. So this is one thing, but of course, just think about police, firefighting, all these emergency responses. Hospitals, of course, have, for example, their emergency preparedness for 48, 72 hours, but after that, then it's gone. And just think about society where the hospitals are not available anymore, or where there's no water coming from the tap. That's also a thing that most people do not think about, that also you need electricity to have a working water system, and without water, nothing is working. So yeah, I could name many more examples. For example, gas stations, they're also not working anymore because there's no gas coming from the pumps anymore. So that's right. Almost anything is working with electricity at this moment. And this makes this topic really important, I think.
And what a lot of film and TV explores is what happens in those moments afterward. But then there's a turning point, and that turning point is when it goes from being a temporary inconvenience to a real problem, whether it's in the medical dramas, which gratuitously have to do an episode or a series of special episodes on the blackout, and then the generators fail, and what do you do with patients trapped in elevators, as they always seem to be. But also just societally, what happens when it goes from, oh no, I can't get a signal on my cell phone, to I have no communication because I can't get television, I can't get internet. Many people don't have radios anymore. So even radio, which could continue with a generator for a relatively long time, radios will tend to drop out as an important source of information. And what happens to people when they look all around them? They don't see any of the things that they're used to working, and they don't know why, and they don't know what to do about it. That leads to a lot of good drama.
Oh yeah, of course. I think it's a for good reason that TV makers and filmmakers love blackouts because you can talk a lot about people who are disrupted in their everyday lives. And of course, you always have these initial pictures of happy people going to school, to work, and not worrying about anything. For example, in The Walking Dead, you have Rick and Shane eating a burger and fries, and everything is there, and you do not have to worry about anything. And then suddenly this happens, and you completely have to adjust to this new situation. And what I would say from watching a lot of TV series and motion pictures in this context is that there are different types how they are reacting to the situation. Some people just, you could say, think that's nothing bad. Electricity will come back, and then everything will be good again. And then there are other people who are somehow feeling that there could be a bigger problem behind the curtains. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Maybe there's also a third type. You could say it's more the prepper type. They knew there's something coming. They are prepared for everything. And somehow maybe they even hope that something will happen. There's a completely different issue. But these two main kinds of people could be somehow representable for the society, because as we have seen with the pandemic, there have been a lot of people who really understood there's a problem now and we have to deal with it, and we have to wear a mask and we have to do social distancing and so on. But of course, there also have been people who think it's more like a flu, or that's it's not that bad as they are trying to tell us. So those two different types could also be a problem with blackouts.
And mostly what we'll talk about in the next few minutes are fictional representations. But first, I'd like you to tell briefly the story of 14 Hours, because that is almost a documentary.
You could say that.
It's so based on true events, and I don't know that every character and every person said what was said, but it does represent what happened after, I can't remember which storm, but one of the big storms. So talk briefly just about 14 Hours and how that really opens up a lot of insight into what happens when electricity goes away.
It's only one picture of many. So as I recollected, it's about a hurricane that's hitting, I think it's Houston, Houston, Texas. And then a hospital is shown how it's completely, you could say, all the services disrupted because the emergency generators are flooded, and of course they have the generators again. And it's a typical thing in these hospital narratives that they always are prepared somehow, but the preparations are not usable anymore for different reasons. Sometimes they had too many savings, and the generators are just not working when you need it, and then you have the situation with the water in 14 hours. And you can see how the hospital staff has to do everything what they are used to do with automats and automatically by their own hands. For example, there's one scene where I have to ventilate babies. And of course, normally this works through electricity and fully automatically. And it's very important, for example, for babies who are born too early that they get their fresh air. And then you have these automated ventilators with a battery of 15 minutes, but then they do not work anymore. And it's quite similar to the Grey's Anatomy scene where they then do it by hand, and they ask the parents to do that. And of course, they are completely worried that they could do something wrong. But at the end, somehow it even, you could say, bonds them even closer to their newborns. And that's something also interesting to see, that in these disaster moments, of course, you cannot dramatize them. It's always a bad situation for everybody. But by thinking about good, you could say, by thinking about solving these issues, then it shows people how they are coming together somehow again. And this is aber not only a problem with blackout movies. It's a typical situation in disaster movies, that from the crisis, the people learn again to communicate with each other, to cooperate with each other, and
appreciate each other in a case
somehow.
like that. Appreciating what the nurses have to go through on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute basis when the parents are the ones squeezing the ventilator.
That's right.
The shocking thing about that TV movie 14 Hours was that, if I recall, it came out in the spring of 2005, which was before Hurricane Katrina hit, and watching this after those major storms, that and superstorms that followed, people are like, well, of course, this is an easy drama to make. But that was before that set of superstorms, and shocking that we got there. Let's talk about some of the other causes. Obviously, weather can be a cause of a major electricity outage. But the films and TV shows that you looked at had terrorism and criminal activity. They had alien invasions. They had gamma ray bursts or solar flares. They had, no kidding, accidents that led to, in some cases, global outages. And in some movies, we just don't know. That is, we're just presented with a situation like most of us would be. Yeah. If suddenly the electricity were to go out and we had no communication, we probably wouldn't know if the cause was a nuclear attack, an alien invasion, some cosmic event. I think here of the Book of Eli, where they go through the movie, it's clearly a post-apocalyptic landscape. And there's references to 30 years ago, The Flash, and things like this.
But you do not really know what happened.
And that's what I want to know. I'm a political scientist, so I want the international relations backstory to how did a global conflict lead to presumably some kind of nuclear exchange that led to The Flash. But that's not what they're telling us.
No.
So when it comes to all of these causes, do you find that any of them are more or less compelling, or do all of them lead to the same place ultimately where it's about the characters and how they get through it?
I think there are different styles, you could say, of these movies. And as you said, the reason is not the main point. Of course, that somehow you have to start with these stories somehow. So mostly maybe in 80% of the story, there has been a gamma burst from sun, or there has been some just technical problem or whatever. So you know something had happened, and now you have to deal with that. And then the main reason is not that important anymore. It's more important to see how people are reacting. And then something has to do with those two paths. Do the people still have the feeling that this is a thing that could be over after some days? Because then the people know, okay, we have to live with this now for a short time of period, and we know, but after that everything will be fine again. But of course, the most interesting narratives and the more dramatized narratives, which are maybe even more attractive to audiences, especially for, of course, a TV series who have to tell a story over the length of several seasons. So you have to deal with this problem a longer time. And if you think about Tribes of Europa, it's a German TV series where somehow the characters are, of course, also as we are fascinated with the reason, but it's more interesting to see how looks a society 50 years after a blackout, after the global blackout, and it's, you could say, fallen back to Middle Ages. And maybe this is one extreme point. The other extreme points would be to show society dealing after a week or 2 weeks with the blackout. So this is even, I could say, I cannot say realistic because I'm not a scientist in this area. But if you're looking into the discourses, it's possible, you could say, that also blackout does not stop just after 1 or 2 days. Right. And I think this is in the fictions a very delicate problem. If the people begin to lose the hope that the electricity will return soon, and then, of course,
then they have to improvise, and
they, this bond of trusting each other in a modern society. I think sometimes we do not think about this. How important is this for everyday social interactions that we, for example, trust each other. And if you do not trust your companions anymore, and you cannot trust them because everybody has to think about themselves, because it's about everything. It's about food. It's about water. About rescuing your family. Of course, this maybe destroys a society.
That's so interesting to think about in the personal context. I immediately go to the house I live in. The house next to us on one side and a few houses down are on the same power grid extension, I don't know what to call it, from the main power lines. The house on the other side of it and going the other direction are on a different branch. And when the power does go out, sometimes I will look one direction and it's all dark, and I will look the other direction and I see light. But sometimes you can't tell during the day. It's not immediately clear. And frequently, I will text or call the neighbor, or they will call us within minutes of power going out, either on our end because we're initiating the call, or from them. saying, "Is your power on?"
Mm-hmm.
And then immediately it's the, "Hey, you need anything?" And it, if this continues for a while, let us know. Come over, or we'll hang out.
Yeah.
And that all feels very good. And I'd like to think that if that lasted for a day, which it has, or a week, which it hasn't quite done, or a month, that feeling of we're in this together, we're going to help each other would still be there. But the fact is, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what the constraints become on just everyday life. The fact of having clean water, the toilets aren't going to work because the electricity at the waste facilities won't allow it to work. But I'd like to think that element of community and trust is there and would have more of a lasting effect, at least at the local level, than it does in many of these movies, where sometimes the Purge series, for example, it's basically every person, every house for themselves. They will barricade because they can't trust their neighbors at that point. That seems a little dark compared to my personal reality, but I also can't rule it out.
Yeah, I totally understand you, because I think there are two main questions, and the professionals from the disaster management who are hearing us, they know about this way better than us, but it's always a question about which area is disrupted from a blackout. If it's just, as you said, just the neighborhood or maybe part of the city, then you always have help from the other country. So disaster management in basics always thinks about disruptions, about disasters which are somehow locally have their local borders, and outside of these borders, normal life somehow proceeds, and they can help the people who are in trouble. But in this just a power outage, as you said, happens now and then. But when you're thinking about the blackout, and when we're talking about a blackout, we mean a national-wide, long-lasting power outage where everybody is somehow touched by this. Then there's nobody you can wait for help, because the FEMA, for example, is not prepared to help. How many people live in the United States?
Oh, we're around 340 million.
You cannot provide food and water for this amount of people. So everybody has prepared for themselves somehow. And we only can hope that everybody did this for just the normal disasters which can occur every day.
That's right. One of the themes that comes up in these films and TV shows that you write about is that moment when characters recognize that things will be different, and what that induces in them. So I watched How It Ends, the Netflix movie, and there's this great moment where he's at the airport very early on in the movie, so I'm not giving anything away, but he's at the airport to catch a flight, and the board literally goes from a few flights being delayed or canceled to canceled, all of them. And then the power does go out there as well. And there's that recognition, you can see it in the actor, that I've got to change my plans, obviously. So he does the thing, which he goes back to the people he knows best that are closest. But then the movie kind of takes that to an extended extreme because it becomes, in a sense, a travelogue. As this character, and I won't reveal other parts, but as this character and others travel to try to get to somewhere else, it's almost like an Apocalypse Now feeling of going upriver and things descend. And as this time goes on, things are decidedly different just in terms of who you can trust, how do you behave in almost any normal social situation. And it seems to me that it's not a perfect exploration, but I thought it was a pretty good exploration of, in one isolated case, how that recognition that things are different affects immediate behavior.
Absolutely. And I think this is more or less a typical thing for those movies and those TV shows that, we have, of course, a completely different perspective on the things that are happening, where, if you could always say, God's view on, we know everything about the situation, we know everything about the characters, and everything what the characters do not know about each other. So we have a complete different understanding of the situation. But if you are feeling what they are going through, then you always have to see they're looking at this world with only their two eyes, and they have to make their decisions on the basis of what they are knowing and what they are not. And this is a very good example with the film How It Ends, because the main character has to figure out how to deal with this problem, always in the context, how bad is it now? And this iconic, I would even say that's a stereotype even in the genre, that these bored with the delayed flights, or you could also say trains. We also have a German series, Blackout, just arrived 2 years ago, and you have it's I think the second or third scene of the movie of the series that at Berliner Hauptbahnhof, Berlin main central station, all the trains are just switches. And this is very important for the characters, because if this happens, there's something bigger going on. If it's just maybe the light is flashing and maybe some trains are delayed, or then you can deal with this. But if you see everything is affected, then this is mostly a sign for the characters that they have not only to change their travel plans, but maybe to think about, okay, what do we have to deal with maybe the next days and the next weeks.
So one aspect of this that you've researched that I want to explore is the importance of radio, because it seems to me there's a dual purpose there from a narrative point of view. One is people resort to any way they can find to get information, which is rumors. And we see that in the films and TV where it's somebody tells them something, they have no way to check that information, so it might as well be true. Or the radio, which is in a sense the last authority-based source of information. And yet sometimes the radio serves a purpose you just talked about, which is almost that role of God, the omniscient narrator, because it seems like for the characters in the story, if they're hearing it from a trusted radio station, that must be the truth. And yet you realize that radio station is getting inputs of information from the same bad sources as the characters. So what is the importance of radio in these narratives that you explored, and what does it say about us that we resort to these images most of us have only in cultural memory of 80 or 100 years ago of a family huddled around a radio listening to a chat from an authoritative source?
When thinking about the Blackouts and seeing all these motion pictures and series, I only hope that everybody has a radio at home. Not only because it can be fun just switching on the radio, also when the electricity is working, but in these situations you could say it's mostly a lifesaver for the characters. Of course, there are problems, as you said. Also, radio stations have to deal with the situation that they cannot trust anymore that their sources are as plausible or reasonable as they were. But somehow they are professionals and they know how to sort these things out. And they have the generators and they're working for some more days than all the other social institutions. So radio is important. And as you explained very well, that the radio is always the last institution of, you could say, not truth, but connecting to society and society communicating with each other. Because as we said, mobile phones do not work anymore. Television somehow, of course, works. That's a dilemma situation, that broadcasting still works, but you cannot see what's broadcast because you have no electricity anymore. And almost nobody has these small battery TV sets. So radio is important to not only get information, but I would say in the shows and the motion pictures, it's like, the last working institution. And that's so important for people in a disaster, that they still have the feeling that something is still there working and working for us and trying to help us. And the most panicking moment in most of these narratives is if the radio just silences and you have only this voice of nothing. This can do a lot to a person psychologically, and of course also to a society. If this last resort, you could say, it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, there's a fundamental difference between right now, as we're speaking here in the studio, if the electricity were to go out, first of all, it would be a shame because this conversation would end rather abruptly. But we would be walking around wondering what was happening. And if we had access to a radio and we could hear people broadcasting saying, hey, we don't know what's causing this, but across the east coast of the United States, power appears to be out. At least there's some connection to the world. We know that the radio stations still exist, that there is a world out there.
That's right.
Whereas in some of these narratives, the characters literally don't know. Sometimes it's just a person or a small group of people more often. And sometimes they have no idea if they are literally the last people left on Earth because they don't have that voice from the radio.
And the problem is that today we are... it's so normal to have always feedback. You're sending a WhatsApp message and you see two, how do you call them in English, these signs that it's got through, and then the blue icon, and then they're answering, and you can see the other person is typing. So it's also in the philosophical discourse, a very typical thing for modern societies that we are somehow always want a reaction to our actions, and that's totally human, I think, to want this. But this is something what is almost completely lost in the blackout situation, because all those communicating systems, it's not just mobile phones, it's everything what we are using every day. They are not reacting anymore to our actions. So as you said, still feeling there is somebody is very important.
Yeah. One of the common applications of this, of course, is to the horror genre, because it's very easy to have that theme of sudden darkness be in a blackout movie. Electricity is associated with many things, but the primary one is light and visibility into what is available to us as a sensory input. So sudden darkness in film and TV can stand in for a whole lot of existential problems, but it almost always ends up being at least somewhat suspenseful, and often something that is terrifying.
That's right.
So I find that not all horror movies that involve darkness are necessarily about a blackout.
No.
It can be evening.
Yeah.
It can be underground. There can be other situations.
But they're mostly dark.
They're mostly dark. And it is surprising upon reflecting on it, how many horror movies do have some kind of a blackout situation. However that's defined, whether it's the Purge series, how the blackout seems to always happen. Yes, it's a nighttime thing, but there also almost always seems to be some kind of electrical outage as well. And many other horror movies, which kind of gets to a different theme here. If it's a plot device to entertain better, to raise the suspense, but they're not really exploring what the darkness and the lack of electricity explicitly does, then it feels different than the other things we've talked about. Then it just sounds like a different way to make you scared of something that goes bump in the night.
It's interesting to think about that, because, one thing about motion pictures and TV shows is always that directors and writers have to think about how do they make plausible what is happening in their shows and in their pictures. And as we said, somehow you need darkness in horror movies, and it's obvious why, because you cannot see the hand of the murderer coming or lying on your shoulder or anything bad that's happening. You see it too late, and that's what makes a horror movie so terrible and frightening. But maybe this is one mean to make it plausible why it's dark, that you have a blackout. But the other thing is that a blackout is not only darkness, but it is so fundamental that, as we said, it's not just about the lights are going off, but the total end of communication, of responding society to your, for example, 911. Yeah, you cannot call anybody to help you.
That's right.
And this would be a completely different case if just lights are off or it's night, because still society is helping you if there's something going wrong. And so I would say it's both. It's entertaining, but also it's somehow needed to make plausible this world, why it is so terrifying to the characters in the situation.
You mentioned calling 911, and that does make me think about the representations in these media about government response. Because, I know my local police department and fire department, and I know that if there were a catastrophe like this, they would be there, they would be ready to help, but they'd be just as confused as we are about who needs help, how to get to them, depending on what else has happened. And I would not know they were there, because I would not be able to call in many cases and get through, because everybody thinks, well, phone lines aren't connected to electricity, but so much phone communication now goes through the VoIP protocols, right? So it is connected to the electrical grid, whether we like it or not. But in films, I'm thinking the typical government response you see, unless it's explicit in the plot, like The Purge, where the whole point is that those resources aren't available. It's often things like, I guess Cloverfield has it to some degree. How It Ends, which we mentioned, has it, where at some point suddenly fighter jets go screaming by, and so there's some visual, and I think it's done mostly for the sound effect. There's the audible evidence of government is reacting to something big. That's the idea. that gives characters some confidence that somebody's out there doing something about this. But it also leads to this heightened anxiety and fear because that means what's happening isn't a substation down the street.
That's right.
That means there's something big and bad. And in Cloverfield, eventually you get glimpses of the big bad. But in terms of government response, you don't often see people walking down the street to their closest police station and just saying, hi, how's it going out there? What do you want us to do? What are you going to be doing? I don't see that in these movies as much as people reacting to what in the United States would be the federal government flying fighter jets around to do. How do you characterize the representation of different government responses in these movies and getting to your overall theme of wanting to help those people prepare better? What do you think that those people, if they watch all of the movies and TV shows that you watched, what do you think those emergency responders get wrong by watching all of this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I think about our two types again, you could say about the short blackout situations in, for example, sitcoms or in hospital drama series, you could say it's the same thing, that they are reacting the way somehow. Of course, they're professionals and they know what they have to do, but they are confused as the people who do not know what to do now. And we could really say they are doing just their best under very bad conditions, and they are working hours late, and they are making extra shifts, and they are trying to just to respond somehow adequately to the situation. But they are of course, we always hope that they know more than we, but mostly it's the same way that they do know exactly as much as we know about the reasons and about the duration of such a situation. So I would say, what can professionals in these areas can learn from the shows and from the motion pictures is that they should try to do as much as they can to prepare for such a situation in advance, so they can more focus on the really main troubles and the main emergencies in such a situation, and they can separate the less important cases. And the second thing is, of course, with the, you could say, big issues, the big apocalypses, and then, of course, it would be helpful if the people are going to their police station, and there are, as I can remember a paper I wrote in Germany where they are planning to do, it's called the, you could say, lighthouse project, that they have in big cities, like places people know where they can go in emergency situation. I do not know, maybe you have something equivalent in the United States, but it's not the fire station or the police station. It can be a community house or something like this, where some food and water is stored, and people can just come together to get good information, trustworthy information. I think that's a very important thing, but you do not have this in very many countries. And I think Switzerland is very good at this thing. They have this for years already. This would be maybe also one thing that we can learn from these pictures, because, as you said, people do not know where to go. They are, of course, staying at home, trying to just wait until this is over. But of course, you need information, you need food, you need maybe medicines for your children or for your grandparents. So this would be important, that people have one place of trust.
And no one place of trust. And I'm thinking here in the American context, I live here. There is no one place that has all of that, right? I would think immediately of a pharmacy, because obviously if it comes to life-threatening issues in the first 24, 48 hours, some people need access to certain medicines. So you would want it to be the pharmacy. Well, there are very few pharmacies I can think of that have the ability to be a community rallying point. They don't have the physical infrastructure to do that. You also want it to be somewhere, obviously with sanitation and with access or proximity to police or other authorities. And I'm coming up blank. It's just not an easy thing to center in on. Instead, what we see a lot in the film representations is not people going to these central locations, but people fighting it out on their own, right? And maybe that's just more dramatic, but you're right. Maybe that does reflect the fact that a lot of modern societies simply don't have that backup plan.
They do not have the backup plan, and I think nobody thinks, of course, it's not comfortable to talk about these things. After writing those two books, I sometimes also feel depressed about, not in a clinical way, but just it's confusing about thinking what could happen. And after all, of course, I did also my own small preparations just to fulfill. For example, I have a small checklist in my book at the end, just what you could do as a normal person with low budget, what would be helpful in such a situation. And I think not very many people have done these preparations, so it's totally normal that they are overwhelmed by the situation when it suddenly occurs. So what I would hope that everybody does a minimal preparation. Of course, you always have this prepper scene and all these. I want to stay diplomatic, but it's not about preparing for the end of the world. It's about preparing to be on yourself, maybe for 7 days, for 10 days, and this is all what I think everybody can do that. And this is maybe one thing that we can all learn also from the motion pictures and from the TV shows. For 80% of the characters, it would be a great help if they have not to go out of their flats after 3 days because they have no food anymore and they have no water anymore and they have to fight zombies to get their medicine. It would be very comfortable just to stay at home.
Well, you raise a good point, which is all of us having watched enough of these movies, I know what the right thing to do is to be prepared, which is to build an underground bunker. And actually, there are a few that do this, right? Where you have somebody who is a survivalist who has built a facility. In the one case I'm thinking of with, is it John Goodman as the actor? But there's one where he's underground and he's recreated like this living room that just looks, yeah, it's a little bit disturbing, and it gets more so. But I should build that bunker that has independent food source, non-perishables, and water, and stockpiled medicines, and maybe weapons, and certainly an independent ventilation system so that I can survive with a small family for 30, 40 years. That's what I think I should do based on watching all of these. And I don't know anybody, people who have means exponentially greater than mine, who will do this, right? And you would think, therefore, the backup plan would seem much easier, which is have, like you said, 7 to 10 days of some essential items. And we'll walk through some of your checklist in a moment. And yet most people know they should do this, and they still haven't. Why is that? What is it about us that pretends like because this is a distant possibility, I shouldn't prepare for what would be a really, really crappy situation?
I just love the example of 10 Cloverfield Lane, what you're talking about with John Goodman's his name. I'm very bad with names, but I know him as Fred Flintstone, as a father figure. And of course, we do not want to spoil anything, but as you said, he is trying to survive I cannot even say what he's trying to survive. He is trying to survive underground, a bad situation, and it looks like that he's preparing to stay many years underground. And what I have learned from motion pictures and TV shows, that's the worst idea you can have because it's always failing. It's beginning with social conflicts, in the underground. You cannot manage anything if you cannot go out.
Go take a walk.
So
Can't do it.
You can't do it. Yeah. And the second thing is, even if you survive, what is waiting for you? It's that world. So that's not very helpful to do that. I think that's obvious. But, it's also a psychological thing. People are trying to do anything to deal with this idea, which are terrifying us. And so, if the people have money, they can do what they want. But that's one thing. And the other thing is, why do not people do the obvious thing? And it's... Maybe also it has to do with psychology. Maybe it also has to do something with our understanding of freedom, or you could say of the interaction of the individual and government. I would say it would be the task also of governments to educate people who are not talking about this topic as we are doing it, who have not watched those movies with the focus on disaster preparedness. You cannot think about the whole society dealing about this topic every day. And, it would be a good idea for a government if they teach their people. If they can do it or they can do it not, but that everybody has the same knowledge, you could say, about this problem, and that they can do their minimum preparations. That would be one thing. And the other thing is, at the end, it's the decision of everybody individually, what they are doing, and why they decide not to to deal with these problems, actually, I can understand that. You do not want to think about that. And that's very reasonable, but it's not the best idea.
It is fun to reflect on the fact that the Cloverfield series has attacked this issue, this human condition, from different spatial elements. So Cloverfield was a surface movie. It was about people dealing in New York City with this event. Then there is the underground in 10 Cloverfield. And then I can't remember what it was called. Cloverfield Paradox, was it? Where it's in space.
Yeah, that's right.
And yet there's an issue with, Earth going dark in a different way. All, very different spatial perspectives. Yeah. And yet it still boils down to the human reactions of people, thinking they can escape it, or thinking, what can I do to fix it or get things back to the way they were? They're all devices to get to the same psychological and sociological issues that you've explored.
At the end, it's always about people and how they are interacting with each other. But still, I think that it can take a lot of pressure from a social interaction if you have enough food and enough water. So you can have both. You can still have conflicts in a small social group, but if you have to fight about bottled water, that's always a good thing.
Well, we can imagine a scenario in which there is some disaster, probably global in scope, and there are ways of getting water, whether it's rainwater, whether it's natural springs, whether it is some reservoirs. And there is some access to food. And maybe it's for hundreds of survivors, maybe it's for millions, but a sustainable situation, even if it is dark and desolate in a Mad Max kind of way. We can imagine that. And that there is no prospect of electricity coming back on. Characters have lost hope, or it's simply presented as this is the desolate landscape of life as we know it. In a case like that, what's interesting is, what is of value in that world, right? People aren't buying the largest television screen to watch sport anymore. People aren't buying the fastest personal device or phone. What is of value? And I go here first to the Book of Eli again, where that's the situation. Is there are some survivors. It's rough, but they're getting by. It doesn't look like they're imminently all dying. And what's of value? And one of the things that of high value is wet wipes.
Yeah, that's right.
when he goes to the engineer to do some trading, one of the things that's of highest value is an unopened wet wipe, because with water being rare, the ability to wash oneself, presumably, through something as simple as a wet wipe, which many of us would get handed to us on an airplane and throw away, that becomes something that is of much higher value than literally him walking in with $1 million, which now have no value.
That's right.
So talk about that. How have filmmakers explored the idea of value in a world in which our entire economic infrastructure has gone away?
I really love these scenes when you could say the rest of modernity, which is still what you can find maybe as a KFC wet wipes in the Book of Eli. I love the scene when he can almost demand anything for those wet wipes. Of course, I do not want to spoil as much. It still has to be interesting to read the book, of course. But
of course,
in the checklist you can find some, and of course it's also funny to think about this. But it has a serious character that it's not about only food and water, but that it's also about not getting sick, for example, if toilets are not flushing anymore. So it's always about to do something with what's coming out of you, even if the water is not working. There are different ideas, but this is a very important thing to think about. But it's also about, as you said, how can we make a market and how can we exchange goods if we have no money anymore. And so there are also different options, but it's the best idea to have something which is very easy to exchange. For example, silver coins or gold coins. Many are just collecting them for fun, and it's mostly in these pictures and the TV shows those people who have something, anything which has some, you could say, universal value. Of course, it's still only gold, but somehow you have to do exchanging, and that's one way, but only one thing. The last thing we could say this is an insider trick is the satellite telephone. As what I learned from motion pictures and TV shows, the best thing you can have is a satellite telephone because it's working always as long as the satellites are working.
And that's the issue. That we come back to causes now, because if it's a terrestrial issue, if terrorists have taken out the electricity grid and incapacitated it, not just blown up one power station, which has unfortunately happened, but somehow found a way to take out the grid for a long period of time, or if it's some kind of earthquake scenario, then that's fine. If it is something like a solar flare or a gamma ray burst or aliens, however described, they've probably taken out the satellites too.
Shit. Yeah. Okay.
I know. You're in trouble now, right?
Yeah.
Then you have to back up to what? Battery-powered walkie-talkies.
That's not the worst idea. Yeah. We can only hope that the alien thing will not become true. Or if it's coming true, then they'll be friendly and nice. And
right.
But still, that's a problem with... you could say there's not always a modern answer to anti-modern situations. You hope that you can always replace anything, The thing with the satellite phones is also, okay, if my mobile phone doesn't work anymore, I just take in my satellite phone, everything is good as I knew it, but that's not how it works. After several weeks, you have to think about something else. And as you said, also the walkie-talkie is only just it's a replacement for something which only work as long as you have batteries, and also batteries are running out sometimes. So there are interesting series like the Walking Dead World Beyond, and it's shown how they are doing their best 10, 15 years after the total zombie apocalypse. And for example, they are very good with using solar generators and battery packs. And they also do not work for all the time. After 10, 15, 20 years, they are failing also. But it's a good idea to have like a backup system to use all the devices you cannot use anymore without electricity. But they would still work if you have electricity. So this is also a good option. And in the TV shows and in the motion pictures, this is always also a lifesaver as a radio.
Right. And it's funny, you mentioned the, aliens, hopefully they won't come here and destroy everything. Of course, that is where the drama comes from, except in some cases. Obviously, this doesn't come up in your research on global blackouts for the very reason that they didn't do it. But I go back to, as a kid, watching a TV miniseries, at least in the United States, which was called V, for The Visitors. And they come to Earth, but they're not destroying everything because they actually want to keep humanity going. And that's all I'll say there. It was remade probably, 15 years ago. They remade it as a new series. But the whole idea was they did not do a global blackout. They did not disrupt. They wanted to keep things essentially as they were in many ways, so we didn't have it. And it's not the only film or TV to do that. I go back to Close Encounters. When there's some alien issue, the lights actually come on instead of going off. It's almost like a surge effect to basically say, we're coming, look out for us. But it's not to disrupt and disable. So there are different ways of playing with this from the alien perspective.
Oh yeah, the aliens loved playing with us when they're visiting us. And electricity is one thing, the easiest thing is that's what we learn from these alien fictions, and maybe we do not think as much what we can learn from alien fictions, but one thing is that we can exhaust humanity very easily just by plug off the electricity, and that's what aliens mostly do, and they are very efficient by this. Of course, you can also use weapons and kill everybody individually, but that's very complicated. It's more easily just to stop electricity, wait 4 weeks, and then you see what happens. It's bad to talk about this, but we're laughing about this because it's a serious thing. But in films, that's also a nice thing. We can sometimes laugh about bad things. And the second thing is that sometimes the aliens, just as you said, want to show we are here, and they have to communicate with us. And in the 13 encounters, it's nice how they are, I think in the last scene, they are playing with lights to communicate with the humans. So it's, you could say, electricity is not only important that our society works, it's also a sign for modernity. It's also a sign for a civilization who is able to deal with electricity. So if aliens are coming to us, we can be sure that they will do something electric, and they know that this is our vulnerable point, that they easily, and it's not only about aliens, it's about, we have to talk about war in these days. We have to talk about terrorism. It's the easiest way to show modern society that's very easy to destroy it.
You mentioned the value of laughing during a situation like this. And that's an angle that I really hadn't thought through, is the fact that a lot of sitcoms and comedies have addressed blackout. What have you found as the common themes in a comedy presentation of a world without electricity?
Yeah, you have always, I would say, maybe not always, but in most cases of sitcoms, you have a blackout episode. And, it's a bit like what we talked at the beginning. It's a small intervention into this perfect world of modern everyday life, and they have to deal with that. And after 20 minutes in a sitcom, we always know everything is good again. So we do not have to worry about the end of the world. We only have to worry about, for example, Sheldon, who is trying to use the situation to show
Big
Leonard
Bang Theory again. Yeah.
that he needs him, and he's using his urine purifying system. So it's just fun to watch them. And what's funny about those narratives is mostly that characters who are fighting each other sometimes, or who have not very close social contact anymore, as neighbors, for example, they have to interact again with each other. So this is, you could say, a stereotype again, as we have also in drama series, or as in the hospital series. But I think that's a nice thing to see, that even a bad situation can evolve in some new kind of partnership with other people, and that we come together again as people, as a community.
Yeah, we don't see too many examples of a movie that is wholly serious, tragic, that at the end turns into a comedy, or a comedy, especially a series that is known for that, and then it goes dark and ends. That would be dramatic. If the Big Bang Theory, if that episode had ended with them not reconnecting with the world, that would be dramatic, right? But yet that's not what the audience is there for, and that changes how we perceive it, because you see a blackout very differently in a movie like Cloverfield, or a movie like, any of the dozens we've mentioned, than you do in a sitcom, because it's going to be okay. You know that they're going to have some hijinks and maybe some serious things in a very special episode along with the funny things, but you're not really worried that they are going to die.
No, mostly not. But there's one exception, and I just love this. Not really an exception, as you said, nobody's dying, so don't worry. But I just love Superstore, this show. And we do not want to spoil too much, but it gets very dark at the end of one season, and I almost cried, because it was so sad what's happening. It shows that even in it's, of course, they are exhausted by their jobs, those people working in the supermarket, and they do not really like what they're doing, but they have this community feeling, and they help each other mostly. And then something happens. It has also to do with a blackout, and they're standing in front of nothing. This is also the last picture in my book, because I've thought that this is maybe a good sign for the whole blackout problem. Only if we lose something we loved, then we know maybe what we loved and what we needed, and what we use in an everyday sense, that we only feel what it means if we lost it. And so it sometimes, even in sitcoms, it can be very dark, but as you said, they survive at the end, and they will rebuild. And in Germany we say, wenn sie nicht gestorben sind, dann leben wir noch heute. Wie heißt das in English? It's if they haven't died, they're still living happily until the end of their lives.
There are some. This is a subgenre, if you will, that didn't exist decades ago, which is, I guess, the dark comedy, where it's presumptively a comedy, but they do hit some very dark themes, and they make that part of the almost uncomfortable humor. So I'm thinking of things in the United States like Community. Superstore, I think, gets at some of the same things. In a different way, the flight attendant. which creates the link back to Big Bang Theory through the actress. But this is a way that you actually can explore some of these themes and not have it be as formulaic, is bend the genre just enough that Superstore might be the one that does it best, is you can have the blackout and you actually do wonder about it more than the typical comedy.
That's right.
Yeah, that's fun. So tell me, what is in... I'm not going to sit here, reach across, and open up your bag that you're carrying, but I'm really curious, what is it that you have, whether when you travel or at home, as a result of all of this research, what is it that you think of as the most important things that you want to have nearby in case there is a global blackout?
That's a good question. Actually, nothing in my bag is for this purpose, but...
So we're in trouble if it happens now. We have to rely on the good offices of Goat Rodeo Studios.
Yeah, the thing is, you cannot prepare for this situation in every minute. Of course, you have your stuff at home, and you have to rely that we are helping each other if something like this happens. But I'm not carrying around a backup or emergency rescue system.
Bottled water on one shoulder, radio, crank radio on the other shoulder.
That would be great.
But at home, you have a few things that you feel to give you some psychological peace. You probably have a few things ready if you need them.
Of course, but I would actually not say that's for psychological reasons. Of course, it also, as always, everything has to do with psychology, but this is only more or less the thing that I read maybe a bit too much and learned too much about this topic. But I tried to stop myself with what officially is what's the official message is by, for example, our German Bundesamt für Bevölkerungsschutz und Katastrophenhilfe. You have the FEMA, and they more or less exactly say what you need, and that is what I have, and that's also enough. And I think it's important to discipline yourself somehow to deal with this issue psychologically in a way that you still have a good feeling about this. You know, if you are preparing for the end of the world, then you have to prepare every day of your life for the end of the world. And this is not a good idea if the society is always in this end time mode.
Yeah, that's a big burden that perhaps exacts a greater toll than the effort of not being prepared and the risk that comes with it.
That's right.
Let's go back to the overall theme I started with, which is part of your mission studying this is to help the people who must respond, is to help the decision makers and the emergency management people. If there's one thing they could be doing differently tomorrow than today, based on what you've learned about the human condition, what is it?
When I'm thinking about the motion pictures again and the TV shows, it's the problem that the politics, governments, of course, they always think about that they have to be reelected. And they do not want to focus on problems in the way they should do it. And on the other hand, there are some politicians who trying to get their benefit from think about the catastrophe. You can think about far-right people who think it's not even a bad thing for us from a political point of view if something is going wrong. So to find a good middle way is not very easy. But what I would say is to, you could say, talk to people in a way that they understand without terrifying them. So I think today it's more important than ever to keep in mind that our world is becoming more complex, that it is becoming more insecure, and at the same it's becoming more comfortable and secure. So this is a dilemma situation we cannot solve. It will be this way in the century that we, if we want to have modern technology, then we have to deal with disruptions and to have to deal with catastrophes. So I'm not sure that this is on everybody's mind in this moment. And I think it would be a good idea from the perspective of governments if they are learning to address the everyday as well as the future problems more directly and more, you could say, to trust the people that they can deal with the reality, that they can deal with what's happening.
I like that. I mean, one thing that these fictional representations have shown us is that you can't fully trust the people to do that, yet there is no better alternative because there is not going to be a perfect government response.
That's right. So you have to trust the people, and at the end, it's the people who have to deal with this individually, and state can do a lot to help those who cannot help themselves, for example, people who are sick, who are old, who need help. But it can also be, it could be everybody who needs help in such a situation, but they cannot help everybody. So where we in an everyday situation can trust each other, that we're helping each other, we cannot trust this. And this is not a bad thing. It's just reality that we cannot trust in this sense, everybody, each other in such a catastrophic situation. So everybody is asked to do their best.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to reach into our chatterbox here to pull out a random question and see. Oh, the chatterbox is wise. The chatterbox asks you, who played the best James Bond?
Oh, my God. Oh, but the easy question.
Oh, really? Because a lot of people think it's an easy question and they come up with entirely different answers.
Okay, I see. Yeah, to be honest, I only know Daniel Craig, but after I know him, I do not want to watch all the others. But I'm sorry about it. I know some of the others, but maybe it's just, as you have heard, modernity is my favorite topic. And I like a modern James Bond who is dealing with women the right way, who is dealing with its own deficits the right way. So I don't know the guys from the 70s, 60s, 80s, 90s, if they did. But they have had their time and it was also fun.
And Daniel Craig still plays some of the grittiness of the character and some of the dark side, which is true to the Ian Fleming novels, but without some of the campiness of the 70s and 80s. And it also is a question that, do you focus more on the actor and how they played it, or more on the role? Because you put Daniel Craig into Moonraker, it's still going to be a silly movie in some ways with a lot of those tropes.
That's right.
And if you put Sean Connery into one of the more modern scripts, it's more about the writing of the character than the acting necessarily. But
that's right.
It's a fair answer. Denis, thank you for coming. Thank you for talking to me about this. And everyone should be very familiar with your books on the pandemic, and then the one we spoke the most about, which is Preparing for the Global Blackout, a disaster guide from TV and cinema. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.